Hey everyone, welcome back to the Wisdom Tradition podcast. Once again, this is your host, Alex Sachon, and today I'll be presenting part 5 of a 6-part series built around the themes of mandala design and the philosophy of meditation. And these are the central themes around which a number of different topics are discussed. We've branched out and looked at a lot of different areas of esoteric philosophy over the course of this series, and today we're going to continue to do the same. We're going to be looking in depth at the Pythagorean mandala of the Tetractys, and we're going to be investigating the key philosophical themes and principles that are embedded in this mandalic design. So this grand symbol is going to be something that we're going to use to, in some sense, rehash and in some sense elaborate on some of the first principles that we've been dealing with over the course of the past couple chapters, as we've been looking in depth in various ways on two different systems of philosophy or esoteric philosophy, the Pythagorean system and the Mahayana Buddhist system. And we've been comparing and contrasting them and sort of integrating and synthesizing them and using both together as a means to dissect the basic ideas that esoteric philosophy contains. So if you can understand the basic themes of these two systems, by extrapolation, you should be able to understand the basic principles of all the other systems of philosophy, from Kabbalism to alchemy to astrology and other related systems. So Taoism, for example. So the basic principles that all are rooted in or founded upon are the same. They share the same foundation. So we've been using two of these schools, the Pythagorean and the Buddhist, the Mahayana Buddhist, as sort of case studies in order to unravel the meaning, purpose, and destiny of philosophy. And so the past two sections of this chapter have been once again going into Mahayana Buddhism and analyzing the themes of meditation and mandala design from their perspective. So in this chapter, we're going to shift over and look at the Pythagorean perspective. But once again, the main ideas are shared in common between the two. So this is going to help elaborate and enhance all the material that we've gone over so far. And then everything is going to be put together in the final section of this 6-part series, which is part 6, and that's called World Civilization as a Mandala. And in order to make that case, I'm going to be drawing on elements of both the Pythagorean system and the Mahayana Buddhist system, and then trying to discuss how we can understand human society or the human soul as a collective entity, how we can understand that as a mandala, and how we can look out into society at the various behaviors of humans in order to try to piece together how this mandala actually fits into the world that we see and into the society that we observe. So these are things we're going to be discussing over the course of that article. And so this article, along with the previous ones, are setting the stage for that ultimate synthesis in part 6. So again, today's episode is on the Pythagorean system of philosophy and their use of the Tetractys as a mandala. As with all my material, is heavily based on and inspired by the work of Manly Hall. And I cite a number of diagrams from some of Manly Hall's rarer works in this article. And these diagrams will help to unravel some of the mystery behind the Tetractys and how we can use it to decipher the sort of inner spiritual world, the metaphysical world that underlies the physical reality. So I hope you'll stay tuned for today's episode. And I'm going to kick it off with the first section of this chapter, which is called the Tetractys, the Grand Mandala of the Pythagoreans. So that's coming up right now. All right, so let's begin section 1 of this current article. I begin: Pythagoras, the Grecian sage who first brought philosophy to the Mediterranean region around the 6th century BC, was, before his formal teaching career began, a widely traveled initiate of many of Eurasia's greatest mystery schools. Pythagoras was not only an initiate of the Greek mysteries, but also traveled extensively and gained initiation into the esoteric schools of Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia, and perhaps even India. Manly Hall notes that, quote, there is an account that Pythagoras reached India and was initiated into the mysteries of the Brahmins at Elephanta, in the harbor of Bombay, and in the caves of Ellora and the Hyderabad Deccan. As an initiate, Pythagoras would have had to have mastered the mystical disciplines of the various esoteric schools he had encountered. These mystical disciplines he brought back to Greece, where, like Gautama Buddha, he entrusted them to a small society of elite students who would secretly preserve and perpetuate these meditational disciplines within the inner body of the Pythagorean order. Manly Hall elaborates, quote, Pythagoras was the first Western sage who introduced special disciplines of meditation, concentration, and retrospection. As taught by Pythagoras, these mystical exercises were essentially the same as those practiced by the Brahmins. Like these Eastern scholars, Pythagoras approached religion scientifically and developed a formula or method for the enlightenment of his students. He clearly differentiated between learning as a means of increasing knowledge and learning as a means of releasing directly the spiritual potentials of the human being. So, in other words, Pythagoras had an esoteric doctrine in which the outer teachings about number were leveraged as sort of the outer symbols of an inner mystical tantric doctrine that would have been cultivated and utilized. And so it's important to emphasize that the Pythagorean system is as mystical as the Buddhist tradition is, but our records of it are much more sparse than our records of what the heyday of the Mahayana system looked like. So I just want to emphasize that point. As we've been exploring throughout our multi-part series on mandala design and the philosophy of meditation, esoteric meditation disciplines have long been associated with the use of special emblems termed mandalas, which are visual designs of spiritual archetypes. The use of mandalas in occult meditation practices is calculated to direct the meditating disciple toward a mystical comprehension of universal realities and principles. Different traditions have different specialized mandalas that they use to communicate the inner mysteries of their doctrines to their disciples. In the case of Pythagoras, the favored mandala of his philosophical school was a simple 10-dot triangular diagram termed the Tetractys. So the Tetractys is 10 dots arranged on 4 levels. The first level has 1 dot, the second level 2 dots, the third level 3 dots, and the fourth level 4 dots. So it's arranged into a pyramid. Manly Hall explains that the Pythagoreans bestowed great thought upon the Tetractys, or pyramid of 10 dots, which they held to be the key to universal mysteries. Quote, the Pythagoreans took their most solemn oath upon the Tetractys, which to them was the most sacred of all symbols and the proper figure by which deity might be most perfectly apprehended and honored. To them, the Tetractys was the supreme symbol of universal forces and processes, with its 10 dots numerically representing, quote, the sum of all parts and the completeness of all things. As such, it was for them the perfect symbol of the inner workings of the divine mind in space. The numerical principles that the Tetractys constellates together in its design were primarily intended to stimulate ideas. The mind, attracted to an object for the consideration of its numerical attributes, was invited by the numbers to investigate and admire those celestial causes which precipitated its corporeal appearance. So in other words, the numerical principles represented by the dots in the Tetractys are intended to stimulate archetypes if you know how to properly ensoul the image with those qualities of the archetypes. Continuing. The Pythagoreans' portrayal of these celestial causes as numbers rather than images is intentional, as, quote, numerals convey the sense of quality and quantity without the impediment of form or the limitations of place and time. Thus, through a study of numerical philosophy, one's eye of internal perception may be opened without the mind being filled by erroneous concepts resulting from grosser forms of symbolism. End quote. And then again, Manly Hall says, in sum, through meditating upon the mystery of numbers, knowledge was increased, arrangements and proportions made evident, and most obscure secrets revealed. Investigating now the basic design of the Tetractys. The core design of the Tetractys consists of the numerals 1 through 9, plus an additional principle which can be evaluated either as 0 or 10. Whether one evaluates this additional principle as 0 or 10 affects how one deciphers the meaning of the Tetractys diagram. For this reason, the Tetractys has 2 possible forms of interpretation. When 0 is added to the numerals 1 through 9, the Tetractys essentially takes on the same meaning as the diamond mandala discussed in our previous article. In other words, it represents the internal dynamics of first cause by which the divine being behind the universe, which is called variously the monad or Vajrasattva or Mahavairakana, is first brought into existence. When the 0 is substituted for the numeral 10, the meaning of the mandala changes, as does the positioning of the numbers within the diagram. Here, the number 1 moves to the apex position, and the Tetractys transforms to become an image of the divine self or monad. This represents the divine self existing over top the world of creation as the one over the all. In other words, in this second alternative form, the self is portrayed in its aspect of internal generation. Here, the self becomes the host and ruler over creation and the divine hierarchy that governs it. In this manner, this second form of the Tetractys mandala functions somewhat like the womb or matrix mandala of the Mahayana Buddhists, which similarly depicts Mahavairakana in his state of active becoming. In our coverage of the Tetractys in the sections below, we will first analyze its higher spiritual interpretation as a symbol of first cause, before later transitioning and looking at it from the other perspective, that of the divine self and its process of internal meditation or active generation. And that is the end of part 1. And then part 2 is going to be called the Tetractys as a mandala of first cause. All right, so before I begin this next section, I want to point out that in the written article, there is a diagram at the header of this section, and this diagram is taken from one of Manly Hall's books, or a little booklet that's called Super Faculties in Their Culture. And this is an invaluable diagram to me. So it has the 10 dots of the Tetractys separated into 4 levels. And then next to the 4 levels are written out the words, for the first level, it says the one God. And then on the second level, male and female. And on the third level, with 3 powers. And on the 4th level, made 4 worlds. So the one God, male and female, with 3 powers, made 4 worlds. That is essentially the symbolism of the Tetractys. And next to that diagram is the Tetractys in the form of numbers, or more specifically with the numeric principle 0 at the apex, and then the letters 1 through 9 slotted into the various positions of the dots below it. So 1 and 2 are on the second layer, 3, 4, and 5 are the third layer, and 6, 7, 8, and 9 are on the 4th layer. So that's the diagram that's at the beginning of this section if you want to look at it on the written article. But now let's get into the actual body. As we covered extensively in our earlier chapter on Pythagorean philosophy, the Pythagoreans grounded their teachings about the spiritual cosmology of the world using the precise framework of number, mathematics, and geometry. While it may sound rather droll or uninspiring to look at spiritual concepts in numerical terms, remember that Pythagoras was also a master initiate of the esoteric schools of his time. The numerical principles he taught symbolized divine principles or archetypes that can be tapped into during the mystical experience. Thus, quote, the whole field of arithmetical speculation had to do with the internal growth of the person. It made possible the exploration of qualitative factors, not merely the assessment of quantities. Therefore, it was the foundation upon which must be built the most advanced type of meditational practice. The numerical principles depicted in the Tetractys represent mental or psychological archetypes. The world itself is conceived to exist as a projection of these archetypes. Its various levels, meaning the world's various levels, being merely these archetypes clothing themselves in various garments of material form. Archetypes pre-structure the design of all forms that come into existence within space. Space is really consciousness, and the world of form is really a thought form that exists within the mind of this consciousness. Archetypes represent the patterns of mind by means of which consciousness projects and builds its cosmic thought form. In esoteric philosophy, creation is understood to exist as the end product of a divine process of meditation in which God, quote, projects the world by visualization or by the power of will and yoga. This projection takes place via the 7 builder gods, or Elohim, or rays, which in Mahayana Buddhism are termed the celestial Buddhas or Dhyani Buddhas, which means meditating Buddhas. So the world is meditated by the 7 meditating Buddhas, which are themselves meditated into existence by the one ultimate Buddha, Mahavairakana. The Tetractys is intended to depict this archetypal creation process in mandalic form. And its 10 dots are captured the threefold nature of the divine self and the 7 rays or principles of mind, which are projected out from it at the onset of creation. The idea is that the 7 creator gods within the macrocosm move in the design of one great archetype. This archetype describes, quote, the rhythm of consciousness moving through the world. This rhythm is the motion of Tao, symbolized in China by the undulations of the body of a cosmic dragon. The disciple of the Pythagorean school, meditating upon the design of the Tetractys, recapitulates within his own microcosmic consciousness the same process of creation as that which originally took place within the macrocosm or universe as a whole. In this way, Pythagoras revealed a kind of yoga, a means of disciplining human consciousness by reference to the orderly procedures of number, which represent the systematic unfoldment of creative processes moving out from their own causes. Hall elaborates on the mystical disciplines that the Pythagoreans incorporated within their school. The Pythagorean philosophy of number was held to be both scientific and intuitive. Once the disciple had been instructed in the principles of the teachings, he advanced by a process of personal discovery. New mathematical patterns and equations continuously presented themselves to his attention. These he interpreted according to his own unfolding insight. As we've discussed, the performance of meditation works through the stimulation of archetypes. Once awakened, these archetypes come alive. The challenge of meditation is simply to awaken them and bring them to life within ourselves. Manly Hall describes this act of awakening divine powers within as one of reminiscence. To Pythagoras, mathematics was a science built upon reminiscence. By this, he meant that mathematical principles were not discovered, created, or invented by the mind, but had an eternal substance in the intelligible nature of things. Reminiscence, therefore, is a recalling of that which is already known, usually by a process of association. One thing reminds us of another, leading to a refreshment of recollection. That which is recollected is drawn into the forepart of attention, where it becomes available again after being seemingly forgotten. By catalyzing this process of reminiscence within its students, the Pythagoreans sought to draw certain deep and hidden knowledge from within the individual and apply it to the deep and hidden mystery of the world. It's a Manly Hall quote. Therefore, by practicing the philosophical disciplines emphasized by the esoteric school, by degrees the wise man could perfect the grand concept of existence and establish his own proper place in the universal program. Again, that's a quote. The initiates of the Pythagorean school utilized the mandala of the Tetractys to instruct their disciples on these archetypal processes associated with the onset of first cause. Later, in the more advanced degrees of the school, these concepts would be meditated upon and mystically experienced. Hall informs us that, quote, as stated by Pythagoras, before any man might have any right to attempt to determine the nature of first cause, he must first be sufficiently disciplined out of the common evils of the undisciplined mind. In the Pythagorean school, the Tetractys served as the primary teaching device through which the student's mind would be brought into discipline. First, this mandala served as a teaching device that laid out the core elements of the Pythagorean doctrine for the student to study and comprehend. Later, the student would meditate on the mandala in order to experience its truths directly during a mystical experience of illumination. So that's the role that the mandala plays in the Pythagorean school, and one of the ways it was used is to look at it as a representation of first cause. Now, there's another way that we're going to be looking at later on that's going to be looking at it as basically a mandala of the effect of this cause. And the effect is the generation of the world soul. But when we designed the Tetractys with the number or the principle 0 on top and the 9 numerals below, it becomes a mandala of first cause. And so this would have been one of the ways that the Tetractys mandala was utilized by the Pythagorean school. So now we're going to move on to the next section. It's called the Tetractys and the Four Worlds. And we're going to go deeper into the symbolism of the Tetractys as it pertains to the mystery of first cause. So we're going to be looking at the four levels manifested out of this first level, which is the first cause. So that's coming up. All right, so the Tetractys and the Four Worlds. And I want to point out again at the heading of this section in the written article, there's another diagram. Again, this one shows the 10 dots of the Tetractys segmented into four parts, these four parts representing the four worlds. And next to each level is a Sanskrit word. So the top level associated with the one dot is linked with the word Atman, A-T-M-A-N, Atman. And then the next level with the two dots is Adi. And then the next level after that is Buddhi. And then the final level with four dots is Manas. And so Adi, Buddhi, and Manas represent spirit, soul, and body, essentially, or Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. And then Atman represents Brahman, which is the essentially the higher unmanifest state of Adi, or spirit. So Adi exists as the sort of outer face of Atman, just as Brahma exists as the outer face of Brahman. So that's the pattern that we're going to be working with here, and we're going to be unraveling this. So in this section is kind of long because each of these levels, Atman, Adi, Buddhi, and Manas, I have a subsection for. So we're going to be going one by one through each of these. There are numerous levels or layers of interpretation that one may go into while dissecting the symbolism of the Tetractys. The diagram located at the heading of the previous section, which is the one we just went over, features one level of symbolic interpretation for this mandala. Here we find the 10 dots of the Tetractys juxtaposed next to 10 numerals arranged in a triangular pattern with the numeric principle 0 at the apex, 1 and 2 below that, 3, 4, and 5 at the tier below that, and then 6, 7, 8, and 9 arranged on the bottom. Above we find a second diagram of the Tetractys, one that emphasizes a different symbolic pattern embedded within the symbol. In the second approach, the Tetractys' 10 dots are divided into 4 levels or tiers, each named using the original Sanskrit word for the 4 primary philosophic principles each level represents. At the apex of these 4 levels, we find the principle of Atman. On the second level, we find Adi. On the third, we find Buddhi. And on the fourth, Manas. Together, these 4 principles represent the 4 worlds of ancient Indian spiritual cosmology. Within and through these 4 worlds are distributed the 9 numerals and the sacred 0, which together serve as the foundation of our decimal system. In this section, we will be going one by one through the philosophical teachings of the 4 worlds and consider how they unfold and interrelate in order to form the 4 domains of first principles out of which the material universe is created. In the Tao Te Ching, there is a famous passage that states, Tao gives birth to 1, 1 gives birth to 2, 2 gives birth to 3, and 3 gives birth to all created things. In this section, we will be revealing how the ancient philosophical teaching of the 4 worlds offers a perfect explanation of this classic passage. Manas, as the third logos, becomes the creator of all things. This power represents God's capacity to form build. The 4 dots next to this principle represent the 4 elements of the physical world, which are the 4 base metals through which this creating power labors. Whereas Manas indicates the power of deity over the lesser forms of creation, Adi, associated with the number 1, represents the inverse. It indicates the greater world of spirit, which plays host to division, but is itself not divided. In between the greater and lesser is the golden mean or divine intercessor, which is represented in Sanskrit by the word Buddhi. This principle represents the power of divine mind, which emerges within the self in order to play host to the lower worlds of material creation. The power of Manas is one of the 3 powers of Buddhi. It is responsible for building out and bringing into the manifestation the various forms that comprise material creation. Its 3 attributes are creation, destruction, and preservation. The 3 dots next to Buddhi indicate the 3 levels of the world soul. One dot represents the spiritual world of heaven above, where the archetypes reside. B, a second dot represents the material world of Earth where mortal lives are played out. And C, a third dot between them represents the intermediary world of soul, psyche, or mind, which serves as an intercessing agent between the two. So in this case, Buddhi is associated with the number 2. So if we go back to that Taoist passage, its meaning is explained through the Tetractys. As we analyze the esoteric significance of these 4 principles, we will make reference to the initial diagram featured at this chapter's header, and also to a supplementary diagram featured below. So this diagram is a circle, and in the circle is a square, a smaller circle, a triangle, and then a cross. And then there's a line, a dashed line, that basically divides the great circle into 2 hemispheres. So the great circle is called Parabrahm, or the great sphere. And I'm going to explain what that means in a second. But in this diagram, Parabrahm is the greater circle. And then Atman, who's the highest principle of the Tetractys in the form that we're looking at it in, the Atman principle becomes associated with this triangle. And essentially, you can look at the triangle as like the 3 logos. And then the manifestation of that is Adi, Buddhi, and Manas, which are these 3 soul powers, or 3 levels of the divine creating power. So Adi represents spirit, Buddhi represents soul, and Manas represents form. Or you could say Buddhi represents a type of pure spiritual mind, and then Manas represents mind oriented towards the formation of form or thought forms. So anyway, that's what this diagram is pointing towards. And now we're going to go one by one through each of these principles: Atman, Adi, Buddhi, and Manas. So let's start with Atman. Atman, the first level or world of the 4 worlds diagram, represents unified consciousness. In ancient Hindu religious philosophy, this principle is personified as Brahman. While Brahman or Atman personifies the highest definable state of God, esoteric philosophy teaches that God is contained within a further state of existence, that which is beyond Brahma, or in Sanskrit, Parabrahm, with the prefix para meaning beyond. In Helena Blavatsky's words, the principle of zero or Parabrahm describes, quote, an omnipresent, eternal, boundless, and immutable principle on which all speculation is impossible, since it transcends the power of human conception. It is devoid of attributes and is essentially without any relation to manifested finite being. Therefore, it is beingness rather than a being. And that's from the Secret Doctrine. Manly Hall expounds on this definition, describing the principle of Parabrahm as, quote, the one universal life, impersonal and without dimension. It is the absolute source and ultimate end of everything. Elsewhere he writes, quote, to define adequately the nature of the absolute is impossible, for it is everything in its eternal, undivided, unconditioned state. In ancient writings, it is referenced as the nothing and the all. By contrast, Hall defines Atman as, quote, the personification of oneness or Parabrahm. Here, the formless assumes the divine form, the one assumes the first veil of Maya. Diagrammatically, Parabrahm is symbolized by the empty circle, while Atman or Brahman can be symbolized as the emergence of the dot in the center of the circle. The image that results symbolizes an eye. When Atman emerges, the eye is open. At the completion of a cycle of existence, when Atman or Brahman is reabsorbed into Parabrahm, or back into Parabrahm, the eye closes and there is a cosmic night of rest, until eventually it comes time for a new cycle of creation to once again commence. With this placing of the dot in the circle, a triad of factors becomes constellated together: the dot, the circumference, and the radius. Synthesizing these 3 factors, the principle of Atman can also be symbolized as a triangle, which is how we find it represented in the above diagram. In Sanskrit, the 3 principles contained within Atman are termed Adi, Buddhi, and Manas. In Hindu religious philosophy, they are termed Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. In some, Parabrahm and Atman both describe unity, but in 2 relative states of each other. Parabrahm is eternally outside of creative involvement, while Atman is the first point of contact between the absolute and the lower worlds of manifest creation. This point of contact takes place through the 3 persons of the Trinity. Each of these persons is involved in stepping down the consciousness of Atman, so that it may enter into a limited and conditioned cycle of creative activity. So God moves into creation from this process of unity, moving itself into a trinity, and then through the trinity is expressed the further levels of creation. So again, that explains that Taoist passage. 1 gives birth to 2, 2 gives birth to 3, 3 gives birth to all created things. But the 1 itself is given birth to by the Tao, which is this ultimate absolute concept. And so the relationship between Atman and Parabrahm are essentially representing this Tao concept. So now, having discussed that first level, we're going to move on to the second level, which is the principle of Adi. And Adi essentially means one or first. And the fact that this is actually the second principle is, again, aligning with that Taoist passage in which the number 1 is subsequent to the principle of the Tao. So beginning the section, if Atman represents the outer face of Parabrahm manifesting in the form of a triad of divine powers, then the next principle in our diagram, Adi, which means one or first, represents the first and highest principle featured in this triad. The first principle of this trinity, Adi, represents the Godhead of creation or spirit. It is like Brahma, which emerges as the outer face of Brahman to become the father principle of the Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva triad. Here, Adi is Brahma, Buddhi is Vishnu, and Manas is Shiva. Adi, as spirit, represents a portion of infinite being's consciousness set aside to be focused into a cycle of self-experience. Hall elaborates, informing us that in relation to Atman, Adi occupies a position somewhat analogous to a focal point. Here, the unknowable potentialities of absolute existence are concentrated and, through the nature of Adi, passed downward and distributed within the negative sphere or field of manifestation as active potencies. Infinite being or Atman thus flows through God, which is spirit or Adi, into manifestation. God emerges out of absolute being as, quote, the first all-inclusive bubble, a magnificent iridescent sphere floating gracefully through eternity. Within its transparent shell, creation lives and moves and has its being. Its purpose finally fulfilled, the bubble bursts and disappears. Its parts are reabsorbed into the surrounding apparent nothingness of Parabrahm. Referencing the above diagram of the Tetractys, the 2 dots next to Adi represent the onset of duality or polarity in the form of spirit and matter. The concentrated area or focal point that the consciousness of Atman flows into is counterposed by a state of relative absence. This void or area of absence represents matter. The lower 2 levels of the Pythagorean triad take place within the concentrated region of spirit, and therefore each exists always in relation to this counterposing domain of matter. Matter is a necessary counterpart to spirit. To designate the latter, one must necessarily also designate the former. It is only when all designations cease that the 2 reunite to become one. In the language of Taoism, when spirit arises as a focal point, it does so as an expression of the principle of yang. This yang principle is necessarily counterbalanced by a yin principle, which becomes matter. So that explains Adi. Adi is the outer face of Atman, you could say, but it also is an aspect of a trinity, so it has no meaning apart from the other 2 principles below it. Because if those other 2 principles were taken away, then Adi would just be Atman. So that's the principle of Adi. So now we're going to go on to the third level. And remember, the third level is associated with 3 dots. So we're going to be looking at the 3 powers that the principle of Buddhi personifies. And then we're also going to be considering the fact that these 3 dots, when you line it up with the numbers, you superimpose the numbers on top of the dots, it is associated with the numbers 3, 4, and 5. And remember, those numbers 3, 4, and 5, if you go back to our series on Pythagorean philosophy, those are associated with the Pythagorean theorem or the Pythagorean triangle, and those represent the 3 powers of the soul: father, mother, child. And so that is depicted in their diagram of the Tetractys in the form of this third level, which in the West, in the Christian tradition, this would be associated with the Christ principle. So Adi would be God the Father, and then Buddhi would be this Christ principle, God the Son, the second logos. And then Manas would be the Holy Spirit, or the third logos. which is also referenced as Jehovah or Yahweh in the Bible. So that's how all of this fits together. But anyway, let's go into this third principle of Buddhi. The philosophic principle Buddhi represents the internal power of soul or mind that harnesses the power of spirit or adi and distributes it out into the field of creation. In the circular diagram above, the principle of Buddhi is symbolized by a cross. The horizontal portion of this cross represents the polarization between spirit and matter, with spirit above the veil of Maya and matter below. The vertical axis of the cross represents Buddhi's extension across this veil to unite the two polarities of itself. The upper and superior aspect of this line connects to the sphere of adi or spirit, while the lower inferior pole of this line extends into the world of matter and becomes involved with manas, the form-building animus power of the soul. So Buddhi is sort of yin an element, and then manas becomes a type of yang element. Overall, Buddhi is an intermediary link binding together the dual realms of spirit and matter. It unites the duality into a triad, bridging the superior incorporeal realm of spirit that exists above the veil of Maya with the lower corporeal realm of material form below it. In the Tetractys diagram, the three dots next to the Buddhi principle are correlated with the triad of Pythagorean principles indicated by their famous 3-4-5 triangle. The Pythagorean principles of the triad, quaternary, and pentad represent the three powers of the soul: consciousness, mind, and form. Often, these three powers are personified as a divine family: father, mother, child. These three inner powers of the soul are an internal expression of the superior powers of spirit that brought the soul into existence in the first place. The soul is born as the product of God the Father, or consciousness, impregnating God the Mother, or mind, which becomes matter, which then gives birth to the universal form of material creation. The three powers of the soul are reflected into three levels of activity that take place within it. At the highest level is the heaven realm, where the spiritual hierarchy resides. Here, the consciousness of self is distributed throughout a hierarchy of divine beings and creative powers who together work to distribute this consciousness throughout the lower realms of material creation. In between the two realms, one subjective, the other objective, is an intermediary realm where the consciousness of the spirit is guided down to inhabit the bodies of material forms below. This intermediary realm is partitioned into 7 levels, where the 7 archetypal soul powers or mind powers are expressed. Only once all 7 powers are fully expressed will the soul generate the capacity to build a perfect material form that can completely express the innate powers and potentials of the spirit. It is the task of Buddhi to ultimately ensure the building of this perfect world form. So that's Buddhi, which again is this idea of mind or soul as a power in the universe. And now manas is an aspect of this soul power and represents particularly its ability to generate and build forms. Not only build, but preserve and also destroy forms. So creation, preservation, destruction. That's the principle of manas. The philosophic principle of manas equates to Shiva in the classical mythology of the ancient Hindus. This principle is associated with the form-building power of the soul. Manas is not a separate power from Buddhi, but rather is an internal capacity that Buddhi contains within itself. It represents the power of the soul to create, preserve, and destroy material bodies and forms. As Manly Hall explains, spirit is the father of the universe, Buddhi is the universe itself, while manas is the organizer of the universe. It brings order out of chaos, brings forth night and day, and establishes the seasons and the things conveyed in the opening chapter of Genesis. In the circular diagram above, the power of manas is represented by a square. And in the Tetractys diagram, it's associated with the 4 dots at the bottom or base level of the pyramid. In both cases, this quaternary design represents the 4 base elements from which manas builds material forms: air, fire, water, and earth. The 4 elements represent 4 distinct planes of matter that overlap. These 4 planes become the basis of the 4 bodies of the soul: a mental body, an emotional body, a vital body, and a physical body. The physical body, representing earth, is a receptacle into which the powers of the other 3 bodies are poured. These bodies exist in planes of matter that are subtle, meaning they are not located on the physical plane of matter, but rather in three overlapping metaphysical dimensions that surround and envelop our physical dimension. The power of manas extends across all four planes of matter and builds forms or bodies within each dimension. In sum, when we place the numeric principle of 0 at the apex position of the pyramid of the Tetractys, we find revealed the inner principles and inner mysteries of first cause. The 0 represents the unnamed one from whom all things come. All further numbers are the outpourings of this eternal principle. The single dot opposite this divine Atman bears witness to the one life which is above and superior to all the others. The two dots by Adi remind us that spirit is manifesting through two poles, positive and negative, or father and mother. These become embodied as the superior world of spirit and the inferior world of matter. The three dots opposite the principle of Buddhi give us the three phases of the soul or mind sphere. And finally, the four dots opposite manas represent the four elements of the physical world: air, fire, water, and earth. So that is the end of that section. And this is where we're going to be pivoting and looking at the same diagram of the Tetractys. We're going to be switching the numbers around and looking at it instead of first cause, we're going to be looking at it as in a mandala of the cycle of generation of the world soul. So this is essentially works as an effect of that first cause. That first cause sets the world soul into effect. So that's what we're going to be looking at in this next diagram. All right, the Tetractys as a mandala of the world soul. As previously discussed, the Tetractys mandala lends itself to two levels of interpretation. In the above sections, we analyze the mandala in terms of its depiction of first cause, where 9 numerical principles emerge out of the abstract ultimate principle of 0 to collectively give birth to creation, which symbolically becomes the number 10. Manly Hall explains that, quote, 10 is the receptacle of the number 1, for it gathers into itself the previous numbers, becoming a second unity from which a new sequence emerges. This second unity is the world soul, which the Pythagoreans often term the monad or numerative soul. This soul is the vehicle of the self during its cycle of creation and is what this second alternative form of the Tetractys mandala depicts. In other traditions, this world soul is denominated Atlas. The Pythagoreans termed it the monad, while the ancient Hindus called it Ishvara. This world soul, quote, receives into itself all the previous numbers, unites them, and becomes a second unity. This, however, is a unity by effect and not by cause. It gives rise within itself to a new order of existence. Thus, in the second version of the Tetractys mandala, we find depicted, quote, the soul as a secondary power over creation. It is suspended from the archetype of number and falls through the numbers into generation. Thus, in Hindu philosophy, it is stated that Brahma provides the principles, Ishvara the form. So the 1 and the 10. As in the Buddhist mandalas, the symbolism of the Tetractys diagram unfolds out of its apex principle. In both cases, this principle is the same, the divine self, which the Pythagoreans called the monad, and the Buddhists Mahavairakana, or Vajrasattva. To the Pythagoreans, the ultimate source wisdom could cognize was the monad. As Hall explains, quote, in contemplating the Tetractys as a kind of mandala, the most solemn consideration must be given to the monad. It is the parent of number, the progenitor of numbers, the eternal parent of generations, the source of life, and the perfect symbol of illumination. As unity, it is the all. Of numeration, it is the first. And as the end of things, it is completion. Elsewhere, Hall writes that, quote, the god of Pythagoras was the monad, or the one that is everything. He described God as the supreme mind distributed throughout all parts of the universe, the cause of all things, and the power within all things. In this way, the Pythagorean principle of the monad corresponds to Mahavairakana Buddha, who is the central Buddhist deity whose inner mental nature is described in the diamond and matrix mandalas that we investigated previously. In the two Buddhist mandalas analyzed in the previous article of the series, Mahavairakana is enthroned at the center of each, with the various levels of Buddhist deities surrounding him, serving as the secondary attributes or powers of this single sovereign being. The Tetractys works in the same way, except for one difference. The primary principle of the diagram, the monad, is not located at the mandala's center, but rather at its apex point. The Tetractys, as its pyramidal design descends from an apex point, symbolizes the divine self manifesting its consciousness through the world soul, which is the internal vehicle that the self uses to bring its powers and potentials into a state of creative expression. The 10 dots of the Tetractys symbolize this archetypal quality of wholeness possessed by the world soul. Thus, the sacred number 10 symbolizes the sum of all parts and the completeness of all things. From the Tetractys' apex, which is wholeness, it diverges to a base which consists hypothetically of an infinity of fragmentary parts. These fragmentary parts are always contained within the wholeness of the self. Furthermore, within the soul or self, each fragmentary part exists as a miniature monad, i.e., as a microcosm of the whole. In ancient philosophy, we often find the story of the manifestation of the self through the world soul symbolized in agricultural terms. As Manly Hall explains, quote, "We begin by taking an acorn and planting it in space. It grows and becomes a great tree, but the tree is only the expression of the germ of life that was in the acorn. Every leaf and branch of the tree was in the acorn. The process of growth merely manifested the powers of the germ by clothing those powers in substance borrowed from the earth about the seed. The spirit of the tree does not actually grow, but as its manifestations increase, it builds an ever-growing form to express them." He continues, quote, "This tree reaches maturity and is itself covered with acorns, each the size of the original one. These were also in the germ of the first acorn, or they could not have come into form. Each of these also blossoms into a tree, and these again are covered with their acorns. But even these distant seeds are found in the germ of the first acorn that was ever planted. This division takes place within the germ, but the germ is never divided, for it is always the sum of all parts of itself." In her writings, philosopher and theosophist Annie Besant, an early peer of Manly Hall's, discusses this dynamic of the divine self or monad manifesting through the world soul or the Tetractys at length. In her book Ancient Wisdom, she discusses this creation process in terms of the Hindu deity Ishvara, where she writes, "The source from which a universe proceeds is a manifested divine being. Coming forth from the depths of the one existence, Ishvara, the divine being, imposes on himself a limit, circumscribing voluntarily the range of his own being. In so doing, he becomes the manifested God. Within Ishvara's self-circumscribed sphere of being, quote, the universe is born, is evolved, and dies. It lives, moves, and has its being in him. Its matter is his emanation. Its forces and energies are the currents of his life. He is immanent in every atom, all-pervading, all-sustaining, all-evolving. He is everything, and everything is in him. This divine self, working through the world soul, is the one flame or light from which all subsequent fires are lit." Besant continues, quote, "Ishvara in manifestation is like a lamp, a light enclosed in a shade. Enveloped in Maya, he brings forth a universe and is enclosed in the universe of which he is the light. Ishvara assumes this veil for the purpose of manifestation, using it for the self-imposed limit which makes activity possible. From this he elaborates the matter of his universe, being himself its informing, guiding, and controlling life." So that is the meaning of the monad. Again, it's this concept of self, and it's no different than everything that we described in relation to Mahavairakana in our previous article, and also on Vajrasattva, which is the topic of a lot of our earlier article on Mahayana Buddhism. These are just different words for the same thing. So anyway, that's the end of that section. So in the next section, we're going to be looking at, once again, the Tetractys, and we're going to be considering the pattern of the septenary, or 7 principles which are contained within this mandala. So we're going to be examining that. All right, the next section is called the Tetractys and the septenary. And I have a diagram, again, at the header here. It's a picture of the Tetractys. And within this picture of the Tetractys, a certain pattern is emphasized. And this pattern is the 7 central dots of the diagram. So there's the 3 outer dots, or the 3 points of the large triangle. that the whole Tetractys forms this triangle, that these 3 dots sort of encompass 7 interior dots, and the 7 inner dots are organized like the famous seed of life diagram, in which there's 1 central dot surrounded by 6 surrounding dots that orbit it. And in the seed of life diagram, it's a circle encompassed by 6 peripheral circles. So that's the diagram of the septenary, and that's revealed in the Tetractys. Now, there's another way that we're going to be looking at in the Tetractys diagram, that you can also look at the septenary as the sum of the bottom 2 levels, the 3rd level of 3 dots and the 4th level of 4 dots, and we'll be considering that later on. But let's begin by looking at this idea of the septenary as the 6 around 1. In its 10-dot pyramidal design, the Tetractys reveals the esoteric teaching of the 7 rays, something we covered in depth in our earlier series on Mahayana Buddhism. These rays represent the 7 mind principles of the cosmic self. Their emergence marks the onset of creation. Together, these rays work to distribute the powers and qualities of the self within the world soul. Manly Hall explains how this teaching is revealed in the Tetractys. By connecting the 10 dots of the Tetractys, 9 triangles are formed. 6 of these are involved in the forming of the cube. The same triangles, when lines are properly drawn between them, also reveal the 6-pointed star with a dot in the center. Only 7 dots are used in the forming of the cube and the star. Kabbalistically, the 3 unused corner dots represent the threefold invisible causative universe, while the 7 dots involved in the cube and the star are the Elohim, the spirits of the 7 creative periods. The Sabbath, or 7th day, is the central dot. In other words, quote, the first 3 dots represent the threefold white light, which is the Godhead containing potentially all sound and color. The remaining 7 dots are the colors of the spectrum and the notes of the musical scale. These colors and tones are the active creative powers which, emanating from first cause, establish the universe. As the Tetractys demonstrates, these 7 creative principles manifest their powers in the form of a cube, which becomes the geometric symbol of the ensouled material body of creation. The 7 rays extend out into matter in the form of a cube. This cube is formed as the consequence of 6 principles projected out in opposite directions from a central 7th point. These 6 directions form the 6 faces of the cube. The 6 directions are the motions of number away from the center, which is the unmoved point of motion. This is the Sabbath, from which the 6 days' work proceed and back into which they culminate. In his writings, Manly Hall often emphasizes the importance of the septenary when analyzing the inner dynamics of the soul. For example, referencing the Buddhist teaching about the septenary, he writes, quote, the universe is composed simply of thoughts and is dependent for its existence on the directionalization of the wills of the 7 Dhyani Buddhas. They are seated upon their lotus thrones, where they remain forever in contemplation, deep in the eternal state of the principle which they personify. Their rays of thought meditation are reflected into every atom of space and establish the inevitability of the septenary law in nature. Elsewhere, he notes that the septenary are, quote, the lords of the mind, and together represent the wholeness of the power of mind that is oriented toward creation. This septenary mind is the fashioner of the great world, the abyss that came forth. In esoteric philosophy, the number 7 is associated with the idea of cosmic law. Together, these 7 creator gods embody the law by manifesting their energies in perfect accordance to it. In philosophy, the septenary symbolizes law, or more specifically, the will of deity revealed through the workings of law. In this way, the septenary symbolizes the celestial integration of processes which constitute the inevitable pattern of conduct for all things. Therefore, quote, 7 is the number of the conduct of God. Another way of stating this is that, quote, divine law exists archetypally within the divine being in the form of a septenary. These 7 creator gods who embody the law perform their creative works, quote, by circulating through their own nature the heavenly fire, which is the life of all things. Describing the descent of this spirit fire through these 7 creator gods, each representing one of the divine self's 7 inner chakras, Manly Hall writes, quote, it is said that the Logos, or the Self, when the time came to create the material universe, enters into a state of deep meditation, centralizing his thought power upon the 7 flower-like centers of the 7 worlds. Gradually, his life force descended from the brain, which is the superior world or heaven, and, stoking these flowers one after another, gave birth to the lower worlds. When at last his spirit fire struck the lowest center, the physical world was created and his base was at the world's spine. Annie Besant elaborates on this creation process, noting that, quote, as the psychological energy of the self descends deeper and deeper into matter, it draws together more and more separate forms. At last, it comes down to the mineral form, where life is most restricted in its operations, where consciousness is most limited in scope. Then, from its nadir, at its lowest point, the life ascends or reascends, revealing and regaining more and more of its powers. Hall then concludes, it necessarily follows that the path of evolution for all things is to raise this spirit fire, whose initial descent made every manifestation in this world possible. So that's the end of that section, and that explores the septenary, or the meaning of the septenary, and also reveals how this septenary is incorporated within the design of the mandala. And now we're going to go one step further and re-examine the septenary from a different angle of the Tetractys diagram, which is the idea that that the 7 exists as the sum of 3 and 4, which is the bottom 2 levels of the Tetractys. So this final section is called 3 Above, 4 Below, and is subtitled The Rose and the Cross. The Tetractys offers us a second way to analyze the inner dynamics of the soul's septenary creative powers. If we consider the Tetractys once more as a diagram of the 4 worlds, we find that the 2 top levels, comprised of 3 dots, form an all-seeing eye over top the pyramid base, which is comprised of the lower 2 levels and the 7 dots they share between them. These lower 7 principles are themselves divided into 2 groups, one containing 3 powers, or buddhi, and the other 4, or manas. The higher group, that of 3, becomes the spiritual nature of the created universe, while the lower group, that of 4, manifests as the irrational sphere, or the inferior world of material form. Thus, 3 is the number of the positive spiritual pole of creation, while 4 is the number of its lower material aspect. As we discussed in our previous series on Pythagorean philosophy, it is the function of the triad to bring equilibrium, balance, and reconciliation to the quaternary. Hall explains, quote, as a mediating number, 3 binds up conflict and restores the balance of the universal process. It is a messianic number and is associated with the power of the human consciousness to reconcile all opposites in nature. Overall, we can conclude from these teachings that in creation, a primary triad of divine principles, conscious intelligence and force, or adi, buddhi, manas, synthesized to create a field of self-consciousness in which the 4 elements of material creation are brought into manifestation in the effort of building and perfecting a world form. Once the world form is ultimately perfected, the 4 base elements comprising it are transmuted back into the spiritual essence from which they were first derived, the 5th element, ether. So the ether is the essence within which the lower 4 elements are derived. Symbolically, this represents the rose separating from the cross, where it functions independently of its involvement in material form. If one looks at the world as a grand cosmic thought produced by a single divine mind, then it makes sense that when this thought comes to completion, the mind behind it will withdraw its projection of it, and the entire massive complex cosmos would die for want of it. As Annie Besant writes, quote, finally, when Ishvara, whose consciousness was the one consciousness in the universe, whose life was the one life, who supported every form, who made the possibility of every separated existence, gathers up his universe into himself, when he merges himself in the one, nothing remains save the center of his consciousness. She continues, writing that, after breaking through the veil of matter or Maya that had previously enveloped him, his light, quote, shines forth in every direction. Dissolving the universe, he still remains, but the circumference that circumscribed him is gone. He alone remains, holding his center unshaken in the very act of merging in and expanding into the infinite, the absolute, the superconsciousness, the one. In this eternal center, there remains the power of vibration. Therefore, when Ishvara merges himself in the one existence, all else has vanished as a form. But powers remain in those subtle modifications, preserved in that unchangeable center in the mightiness of the one life. So this idea of withdrawing the form back into the seed, the spiritual seed, is this idea of the three withdrawing into itself the four. And it does this because the three are together encompassing the ether. And so the ether is what the elements withdraw themselves back into. So with this discussion, we find the idea that at the dissolution of the universe, the seed of being or self that initially created the universe becomes preserved in the womb of existence, which it will eventually emerge back out from at the onset of a forthcoming cycle of existence, or a yet subsequent cycle. Writing of the eventual reincarnation of this divine self, Besant writes, quote, "When Ishvara arises in order that a new universe may be formed, he throws his life into those meditations that had apparently disappeared. From his own revivified memory, he draws his consciousness under the impulse of the great breath and limits himself again to self-consciousness, turning his attention to the contents of himself. As he does this, his powers start into activity. The memory-prompted desire of this divine bodhisattva is what arises in the bosom of the eternal at the root of the next cycle of creation. This desire becomes the seed that will germinate over the course of the next cycle, which the great Dhyani Buddha Mahavairakana, the eternal penitent, will once again project from his own consciousness as an act of cosmic meditation." So that is the end of this article, and that all exists that whole discussion exists to describe the idea that the Tetractys is particular in its form where it represents the monad or the self, the internal generation cycle, is demonstrating this idea of a projection out and then a withdrawal back in. And actually the other diagram of first cause exists to demonstrate how this also happens on the largest scale of the universe itself. So the monad is really like our solar system or our world that we're in and inhabit. And that's based on an archetype of the whole universe, the ultimate macrocosm, which is what the diamond mandala depicts, or what the Tetractys in the form of first cause depicts. Anyway, that's how I interpret it. I can't say that's definitive, but this is the way I interpret these two alternate ways to depict the mandala. So that's the end of this article. I have following it part 6, which is called World Civilization as a Mandala, and that one is going to be synthesizing everything we've discussed together and putting it into a social picture. So this is going to be an important section in this overall book that we've been doing, this book project called Philosophy as Origin, Purpose, and Destiny, and this idea of using the resources of philosophy to reframe human life on an individual scale, and how the individual relates to the collective and how the collective relates to the universal, the spiritual, that these notions are now going to be understood in a kind of precise way of thinking and applied to the social landscape in a precise sort of numerical pattern. And that's going to reveal a lot of things, I think. A lot of important truths are going to be revealed about society and about the structure of human life and human civilization by applying these philosophical concepts and these mandala designs in order to dissect the social sphere. So we're going to be using the law of analogy, which states that the collective is designed like the individual, which is also designed like the universal. So now with this discussion of these archetypes, these archetypal principles that we've been building over the past several articles, we're going to be applying these archetypal ideas to the study of human life. And so to find out what we discovered doing that, tune into the next article, which is part 6. And that's going to be coming up soon. So thank you very much. Once again, this is the Wisdom Tradition Podcast. My name is Alex Sachon. Thank you for tuning in.